Hello, everybody, and welcome to another week. I want to start by saying almost everybody has done a very good job answering the hat question. That's exactly what we're looking for. You can see your grade on the little grade section of Moodle. I put up those of you who have filled it up. There's actually a few of you who are still haven't turned in your hat question yet, but those of you that have done mostly a good job. Just make sure that you adhere to the guidelines. Make sure it's a full paragraph that you're talking about. In the future, and this isn't a big problem, but in the future, try and take a side. I don't want you to say I both agree and disagree because we could say that about anything. Take a stand and make an argument why you're taking that stand. That's part of becoming a historian, is to make an argument like that, and I want you all in this class to become historians. So something to keep an eye on moving forward. But overall, it's a pretty good job, I think. I'm pretty impressed, especially for your first time trying one of these sourcing activities. So just overall, good job, and keep it up. And make sure you have your responses. I see one, two, three, four, five of you have already sent in your responses as of the time I'm taping this. So just make sure you get your responses in by this Friday, the 27th at noon. And I think that the ones who have done it, it's a pretty good job so far. That's a long way to say I'm impressed and I'm proud of you to this point. But as promised, we're going to talk about slavery today, uh, as promised by our syllabus. If I could, I can't do that. Anyway, so we're going to go over slave trade, volume and duration of the trade, the Middle Passage, what we know as the Middle Passage, British slavery in general, the differences between indentured servitude and slavery, racial codes, and we'll get a little into slave resistance. And I've done some research into these areas in the past, so hopefully I can lend some insight. And we'll start by going over some of those maps we left off with last week. This one, where are the slaves coming from? Mostly West Africa, because a couple of reasons, but the most obvious reason is it's the easiest place to get slaves from is along this West African coast. They don't want to go too far because it costs more to transport slaves long term. And I also, as part of what we're doing here, want to address some preconceived notions, some misconceptions, maybe some stuff that you might have believed that isn't quite as true as it once was. But so the first one here that I want to go over is slavery in Africa, because I hear an argument, I've heard an argument before that slavery had existed in Africa for long periods of time before the Europeans ever came there, and that is kind of true. Not the way that the people who say it want it to be true, though. So just for a sense of geography, so we're in this area right here. This is West Africa, where the majority of slaves that come to the New World are from. Here's East Africa. It's different, right? That's when you're thinking of plantation slavery, there was some scaling of plantation slavery over here, but it's a completely different culture. This is a whole continent here, and it doesn't look this way on a map, but it's huge. You can fit pretty much the United States and Europe and South America into Africa with tons of room to spare. So it's a little misleading the way our maps are set up. Actually, it's a huge area, which is a way to say that they are not at all. The people who live on the whole of Africa are not at all similar. There are similarities in regions, but mostly they're different. In this area, in West Africa, though, just to sort of generalize a zoomed in area, there is a degree of slavery, but it's not the plantation style slavery that we've become accustomed to in the United States. It's not the same kind. It's a kinship slavery. And kinship, going back to the root of the word kin there, it's a family style slavery. So most people living in Western Africa before Europeans arrived, and I don't want to say most people generalize, but I'm going to generalize. Most of the people who are living here live in these extended family units, these kinship networks where everybody is related. So think of it as like your great grandfather and mother with, everybody that's coming down below them. So that sort of large extended family where you could have people marry in or marry out. But it's really a large extended family, up to 30 or 50 people in some cases. And what's significant here is that your life is tied to the kinship network. You have to be part of a kinship group. And as part of that, people would be absorbed into other kinship groups, even if they're not related by blood, and they would be considered slaves of a sort. So we have this idea that slavery is property, and sometimes it is, a lot of times it is, But in this kinship idea, it's not just property; it's belonging to a group. Uh, a major way to get kinship slaves or people into your kinship group is after these small kinship groups or even large kinship groups go to war with each other, and the losing side would have a handful of survivors who would be absorbed into the defeating or the conquering tribe's kinship network. Excuse me. So when we're talking about slavery that had existed in West Africa, that's mostly what we would have been, talking about. If there's any questions about this, please feel free to bring it up on the weekly discussion forum, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about it. If anybody else knows something about it that you could fill us in, feel free to do that too. Back to the map as a whole, though, where these slaves are coming from. They are coming from these coastal areas, mostly just because it's easier to transport people from the coast outwards. And this just gives you some numbers of where they're coming from. I think some of these arrows are a little misleading because there's 1.1 million here, and it looks like a much smaller arrow than these 1.5 million plus arrows. But this is, the major regions that slaves are coming from, and this is where they would be going to. So Brazil is a huge importer. Some of these areas in the Caribbean are huge importers. The United States is actually a smaller importer for a couple of reasons, which we will get into. Here's a zoomed out map of where they're coming from and where they're going to, and we can see the percentages. Only about 4% of slaves coming from Africa go to British North America. Brazil and the West Indies get huge amounts of these slaves for a couple of reasons, and I'll just briefly say that slaves are more likely to die a lot quicker in the West Indies and Brazil just because they're worked to death. In British North America and some other areas in Mexico and elsewhere in South America, owners decided that it was cheaper to maintain slaves than to just keep buying new ones. But they're growing different crops too. In the West Indies, sugarcane is a major product, and sugarcane harvesting and farming in general is actually pretty brutal because it demands long hours and a lot of physical exertion. And it was decided by a lot of these plantation owners in the West Indies that it was cheaper just to kill off or let the slaves die and buy new ones because there's not much skill that goes into harvesting sugarcane. And so, I mean, the people who were taken as slaves, I mean, you don't want to be a slave ever, but you would rather have been a slave somewhere where they're not growing sugarcane. Not to say that any slavery was good, but some types of slavery were worse than others. And we have another map right here that slavery wasn't just confined to West Africa and the New World. There's also degrees of slavery in over here in the Middle East, and this sort of side of Africa is the Muslim side of Africa. So there's this own slave network over there. There's also slaves being pulled into North Africa here, but not a whole lot, and they're very small percentages going to Europe. So there are slaves going all over the place coming from Africa. Everybody just sort of decided that African slaves were the best kinds of slaves to have here. So I think we've kind of got an idea of where these slaves are coming from and where they're going to. Just to, back to what I was talking about earlier, it's a different kind of slavery over here than it would have been over in this side of Africa. Plantation slavery does exist in some of the islands and coastal areas of South Asia and the Middle East. So that's the situation we're dealing with when we want to start our conversation about slavery. Just to put some numbers on it, these are the estimated totals. The slave trade, the African slave trade, lasts for over 350 years. The estimate is 43,600 total voyages. That would include 12.5, so 12.5 million Africans forced aboard European and American slave ships, with about 10.7 million surviving that middle passage, disembarking in the New World, which means about 2 million, a little less than 2 million. That's a lot of people if you think about it. That's more people than attend our community college to certainly make it on this voyage. So they don't, about 2 million just die on the trip over. So these are, it's a rather rough trip. This is a blueprint from a slave ship known as the Brooks. It's a sketch used by abolitionists as evidence of the inhumanity of the Middle Passage because you can see how tightly crammed people would be in on these slave ships. I'm sure you've seen an image like this before, and this would be like the up and down view where you can see that they are packed so tightly in there, with the idea being the more slaves you bring over, the more you can sell. So it is, I mean, it's not a nice passage for any slave on one of these ships. So here is actually a photograph from 1868. These liberated slaves on the Indian Ocean. So the slave trade is going on the Indian Ocean, of course. This would be an image of slaves who were liberated from East African slavers in the late 19th century. And here's another image from the same time period from that same boat or the ship, where these you can see how tightly packed they are on the deck. So it is a rather rough voyage in general. Now, a lot of these slaves we don't know very much about. Some of the British slaves, though, we do get these what are known as slave narratives out of it, and maybe the best well-known one is by this guy Equiano. Equiano was taken from Africa. It's actually got this book that he wrote, the interesting narrative of the life of Odilao Equiano, written by himself. He's also known sometimes as Gustavus Vasa. In a bigger class, I would have assigned this book for you guys to read, but I encourage you to find excerpts from it online somewhere else, because it is a good book. It gives you an idea into the life of a British slave, and he wasn't a plantation slave. So at first, British slaves were treated a lot like indentured servants, more than they would have been plantation slaves like we think of them now, chattel slaves. So he's one of these better early examples of this kind of slavery. Not to say that he had a good life at all, but I don't think his life was necessarily typical. Here's another image from uh, of the horrors of the slave trade that was the focus of early abolition movements. The abolitionist movements don't really get going until a little bit later, from the period we're talking about here. Um, Here's another scene depicting from an English handkerchief. It's a male and female slave working tobacco fields alongside an indentured servant, because again, at first British slaves were treated a lot like indentured servants. Just you hadn't paid them for anything, and it wasn't actually their idea to come over. Indentured servitude, I think we probably learned a little bit about, especially in middle school. That's where I remember learning about it, where this is white people, Europeans, who wanted to come over to the Americas, and if they can't afford it, they get a sponsor, some rich person who brings them over, and in exchange for paying for their passage over, they agree to spend usually about 7 years as their servants, where they couldn't really leave the land. They were tied to the land, sort of like serfs, if you will. It's different than slavery. Slavery, nobody really has a choice. Not really has a choice. Nobody has a choice in being a slave. They're just brought over and forced to work on the lands. So with this influx of slaves, though, more and more slaves are coming over. We get the rise of racial codes beginning about 1640 to sort of differentiate between white people and black people. And so in 1640 in Virginia, we get the first of these racial codes. All men in households are required to be armed except for Africans, and this is to protect against slave insurrections. We get another racial code. Children follow the condition of the mother. So if the mother had been a slave, because there's a lot of interracial, uh, you know, relations going on in the mid 17th century. So by 1641, Virginia is deciding that children, if their mother was a slave, they would be a slave. If their father was not a slave, they would end up being uh, a slave anyway, depending on the condition of the mother. So I sort of explained that poorly, but it has to. So anyway, condition of the mother determines their servitude or non-servitude. By 1664, Maryland, where I'm from, unfortunately, all slaves are served for life. Beforehand, there were terms for slaves, and manumission was common. Same year, interracial marriage is banned in Maryland. By 1667, Christian baptism does not make a slave free in Virginia. One of the early arguments for using African slaves as opposed to other types of servants was that Christians were allowed to own slaves as long as they weren't Christian. So once slaves figured this out, they decided to become Christians, so they couldn't be slaves. But by 1667, this is no longer the law of the land in Virginia, and it spreads to the other colonies too. By 1669, slaves killed during their punishment is not considered a crime in Virginia. Also, a few years later, in 1691, interracial sex is criminalized. White women who bear mulatto children would be fined or sent to an indentured servitude. And when we say mulatto, That's an ethnicity. That means a mixture of white and African um, lineage. We don't use that term anymore. It's not considered in vogue anymore. By 1692, a year later, freed or manumitted slaves must be transported out of the state because you don't want this, or they don't want this mixture in Virginia. And then by 1723, free blacks are explicitly denied the right to vote in Virginia. And this is mostly codes in Virginia and Maryland, but they extend pretty much all over the country, at least in the South, eventually. Now, a lot of these racial codes would have been in response to the rise in slave conspiracies or slave uprisings. The first of which we're going to look at here is this uprising in 1676 in Virginia, known as Bacon's Rebellion, led by this guy, Nathaniel Bacon. He forms his own private army of Africans, so slaves and non-slaves, and whites, to make war on Indians. He wants to fight the Indians, but the governor of Virginia had ended up saying no. He wants to do this because he wants land in Western Virginia, not to be confused with West Virginia just yet, because that's not a state yet. So the governor says no to Bacon. So what he ends up doing is forming his own army here. He ends up leading some attacks against Indians and others. What ends up happening here is that he ousts the governor in what becomes a rebellion. So this is a rebellion by Bacon. After the governor is ousted, Bacon goes west to fight these Indians, and British soldiers, actually regular redcoats, are dispatched to put down this rebellion. But before they can put it down, Bacon ends up getting sick and dies. So in response to this, a lot of slave codes are passed in Virginia to separate whites and black, or white and black labor from each other, to keep conspiracies or uprisings like this from happening in general. Not a couple decades later, we get this New York slave conspiracy, the next big one we're going to talk about. There's this huge fear that blacks and white poor people were going to unite and attack the government after this outbreak of arson that happens in Manhattan in 1741. Africans, freed slaves, are blamed for this, and there's rumors of conspiracy by the poor whites and slaves together lead to this figurative witch hunt that surpasses Salem in scope, actually, where a whole bunch of these conspirators they end up being put to death for being involved in this conspiracy. So this leads to more and more racial codes across the country. We looked mostly at Virginia and Maryland, but they do extend elsewhere in the country. And so here's just an image I like to show. So when we're talking about separating out the whites and the blacks, after these conspiracies, black labor is separated from white labor in large scale to keep poor whites, from working with slaves or freed blacks. And here we have an image of a sugarcane farm where black people are just toiling, working with sugarcane. Now we're going to shift over to this Atlantic trade system, which is all sort of intertwined with the African slave trade. So we go over the trade system, the four regions of colonial America. Hopefully we'll figure out a little bit better about them and how colonial government works here. So this is what the Atlantic trade system looks like, and we've looked at this map just briefly before. So slaves would come to the Americas, where they toil and they produce these raw materials that are sent to Great Britain or elsewhere in Europe, where they'd be turned into finished goods and sent back to the colonies. So it's this very complicated, or maybe not so complicated, trade system. It is, though, the next big step in the Columbian Exchange, and this is where we get the origins of modern economics, with banks in the Netherlands and England creating insurance companies on these shipping to insure shipping companies. And that brings us to mercantilism. And mercantilism, we have the definitions here. The government dictates foreign trade to create profit for its merchants and establish a favorable balance of trade with other nations. Under this system, colonies exist for the profit of the mother country, sort of like a relationship from lord to their vassals. In imperial history terms, when we're talking about imperial countries, the center would be called the metropole. So you might hear me say the word metropole, and I'm talking about the center. In this case, the example we're going to go over, England is the metropole with their peripheries, and the American colonies would be one of their peripheries. when we're talking about mercantilism. This is what we're talking about. Part of mercantilism, Britain passes what's known as the Navigation Acts for these reasons here. And under this system, colonies, we have to stress though, they do exist for the profit of the mother country. Now these navigation acts. So the first one here, oh, geez. The first of the navigation acts is the Enumerated Goods Act, and what they're doing here is that Britain doesn't want sugar and tobacco, or wool, indigo, rice, other stuff, for example, being produced in the colonies being traded with France. So they passed this act to prevent British colonies from trading directly with France. Everything has to go through Great Britain first, which creates this monopoly for British vessels for these goods. Only English ships are allowed to pull out of British North American ports with these types of goods, which also leads to a monopoly for British manufacturing, another one of these navigation acts. So British manufacturing, what this means is that any manufacturing done within the British world has to be done in the metropole. So that means in Great Britain itself. That's what we're talking about there. And I have a chart here to show you what's being exported from the colonies in 1770. The value is in British pounds. So there's a lot of tobacco, some wheat, fish, rice, indigo, whale oil of all things is coming out of the colonies, and it has to go to Great Britain as part of these navigation acts to be turned into something else there. Now, what I want to show you here is that North American colonies were not the most important colonies to Great Britain. The West Indies were much more profitable because of sugar, of course. The sugar interest is hugely profitable, and there's a lot of planters becoming very rich in the West Indies, and they end up buying their way into Parliament. And just for a down the road explanation, this is why the West Indies don't join in the American Revolution. There's a call from British North America for the West Indian British subjects to join in on the revolution, but they don't because they make an awful lot of money. They make way too much money, and they end up joining Parliament, and they get representation that the colonies in North America didn't have. And we've talked about some of these North American colonies, what becomes the United States in this region. They are not as profitable because they weren't founded solely for profits. They were founded for other reasons, a lot of them. And we've been over this particular map before, but I think that's an interesting thing to note. And I just want to show you some population growth numbers. So by 1625, in British North America, there's fewer than 2,000 people. I think that's a very low number, actually. But not that long, not even 20 years later, it's up to 50,000 people, and by the time of the Revolution, there's almost 2.5 million people living in British North America. So there's in the course of a little over 100 years, this population explosion in British North America. And today the population of the United States today is about 300 million or so, for reference. So here's compared with the French colonies. You'll see that the French they never get large populations because the French aren't as interested in colonizing the New World as British people were. And that's going to bring us to these four major regions of the colonial North America. And so I'd like you to remember these regions, especially. They'll help you define colonial America whenever you're talking about it. So, of course, we have the New England colonies way up here, and that's still called New England today for the most part. Then we have the middle colonies, it's Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, and New York to some extent. These are known as the middle colonies. The Chesapeake is Maryland and Virginia mostly. Special place in my heart because that's where I'm from. A lot of territory, and these aren't hard and fast lines. The lower South, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. There's some overlap of what you're growing here as to the Chesapeake colonies too. So there's lots of diversity among these colonies. Nothing predetermines though that they'll become a country. I think that's important to keep in mind because there are varying degrees of who's interested in what in these colonies and what they're there for. In the South and the Chesapeake, they're there mostly for profit. In these middle colonies and in New England, it has a lot to do with political freedom and religious freedom, most of all. So these are the major regions of British North America leading up to the revolution in the colonial world. And just we've talked a little bit about ethnicity before. There's about half are um, English ethnically. We also have the Scotch-Irish mix, there's Germans, some Scottish people. There's a large slave population. About 20% of colonial America is African or in origin. Some Swedish, French, and Dutch too. And there's this other category, and I don't know how small these numbers get, but people from all over. We talked about a Jewish population, in and around New York, as early as before it was actually New York, when it was New Amsterdam. So there is some diversity in the colonial Americas, and then we've looked at this map, I think, before, just to sort of illustrate what the predominant ethnic group is and where that ethnic group would have been. And now I know we're doing U.S. history, but we have to jump back to England just for a second to talk about what's known as the Glorious Revolution, which we did briefly mention before. So here's the execution of Charles I. I know we talked about this just a little bit before. This happens in 1649. This guy, Oliver Cromwell, takes over for about a decade, but he is ousted kind of quickly. I guess quickly. It wasn't quickly for people living through it. And we get this restoration period with Charles II, who becomes King of England for a couple of decades there. So Charles II, James II is also part of this restoration period. Now, James II, who was brother to Charles II, were these guys, like Charles I, were closet Catholics. They struggled with Parliament. And what James II ends up doing is that he revoked 7 colonial charters to create the Dominion of New England, consolidating those colonies into one sort of more easily manageable colonial powers. And he ends up being overthrown in the Glorious Revolution, and this is actually a peaceful revolution, which foreshadows the American Revolution about a century later. His son was actually baptized Catholic, and Parliament ended up inviting a Dutch Protestant, this guy, Prince William of Orange, to invade. So he comes over, and he was actually married to James II's niece. So that's where his legitimacy comes from. So Parliament says to this guy, Prince William of Orange, to come invade, and we'll make Mary queen. So he does invade. James ends up fleeing England, and we get this dual monarchy in England for a little while. Sorry, I should have come over here earlier. We get this dual monarchy in England for a little while with William and Mary, the same William and Mary that the college in Virginia is named after. And so his wife, Mary, is the next Protestant in line to the British throne. It's actually James II. And so this dual monarchy happens. Part of the deal is that William of Orange has to sign a Bill of Rights in 1689, which foreshadows our own Bill of Rights. And here's an example of some of the rights that are part of this Bill of Rights. King can't suspend the laws without the consent of Parliament. He needs the approval of Parliament to make taxes and maintain an army. And some of these other, you can pause this if you want to read through some of these. But this is a glorious revolution because there is no bloodshed. That's why they call it this. But it's also a glorious revolution to the American colonies too, which is sort of connected to the actual glorious revolution. We get a couple of mini revolts in what becomes the United States and the American colonies, beginning with Jacob Leisler's rebellion. Leisler ended up instituting a dictatorship that stripped the privileges from rich merchants who had been in charge in his territory. He ended up being hanged a little bit later on. So the argument that comes out of this is that the American colonials wondered if they had no right to revolution in the colonies. That was a big question that comes out of that, which leads us to this constitutional theory after 1688, so after the Glorious Revolution, led by this guy, John Locke, who you might have heard of before, Life, Liberty, and Property, right? The United States changes it when they become the United States to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because not everybody's guaranteed property as far as the early United States was concerned. So John Locke writes this 2 treatises on government in 1689, And what he comes up with is this social contract theory, and it's a justification for the revolution. And what the social contract theory states is that all governments are based on a contract between the government and the people. And if a monarch, and a king or a queen, doesn't uh, doesn't respect natural rights, that the people have the right to overthrow him. So that's sort of the social contract theory that comes out of the Glorious Revolution. And you can see it wouldn't be very appealing for monarchs to hear constitutional theory like that. There are two parties that emerge after the Glorious Revolution, and they divide based on how they understand the Glorious Revolution. So these two parties are the Whigs and the Tories. Whigs are more in John Locke's camp. Tories, though, they reject that constitutional theory. Um, in limited governments, Tories, they think that the monarch should be absolute. And if we think about this in sort of modern terms, we would think of the Whigs as more liberal. The Tories would be the more conservative of the two parties. Don't think of them in terms of the modern Republican and Democratic parties, though. I mean, it's just liberal and conservatism might be a way to think about it. So the Whigs, though, they endorsed that Lockean constitutionalism. They wanted limited powers for the monarch, and they were strong supporters for Protestant dissent. Excuse me. The Tories, on the other hand, they reject the constitutionalism. They think that monarchy should be absolute, and they are strong supporters, of the Anglican Church, meaning they don't necessarily agree with Protestant dissent against the church. In our own sort of historical narrative in the United States, the revolutionists are all Whigs because they believe in the idea of constitutionalism and limited power for the monarchs. So these parties continue to exist well up until the American Revolution. The Whig Party actually exists after the Revolution is over, and you'll hear people called Tories during the Revolution, and that's part of this Tory party here. Next, we want to move on to getting into some of our Bill of Rights, what we know about, and like the origins there. And we'll start here with the John Peter Zenger trial, and this goes back to 1734. John Peter Zenger is a printer in New York. He's a printer of the New York Gazette, and he's got stuff to say about one of the new royal governors, this guy William Crosby, and they're not very favorable things about the governor. So he's arrested. John Peter Zenger is arrested, and his lawyer's argument that is, if something is true, you can print it, but if it's a lie, then it's liable. And what John Peter Zenger did was he was printing these things about the governor, but what comes out of this is that the truth can never be liable, so you can't be arrested if what you're printing is true. The former British tradition before this trial sort of stated that if it damages a person's reputation, then it's liable. But what comes out of this, and where it comes to the freedom of the press, for the first time, people are arguing for the freedom of the press, that the truth can never be liable. And that's what I want you to take away from the John Peter Zenger trial. So if I was to ask you about it at a later time, you would be able to tell me more about it. Okay? And I think that's where this lecture is going to end. Next week, we're going to get into the French and Indian Wars, because that's the next topic we have to do there. And to preview that, I'll bring up a map, because we can never have too many maps in this class. And this is just sort of an overview of what becomes North America looks like. And keep in mind that there are a lot more Indian tribes here than are represented, because there are no Indian tribes represented here. These are territories, though. France does not own all of this land in practice, because there's just not that many French people living here. Even these areas over here that are British, you can see this is where in the darker, the shaded areas where there are British colonists, and these sort of diagonal lines, this is where Britain claims, but there aren't that many colonists actually there. But on the whole, there's more Indians living here than there were Europeans at the time. So don't let this map be too misleading for you. Okay, and I think we'll pick up there next week. So thanks for bearing with me, and I will see you on the next lecture, the next video.